She walked into the corporate boardroom, chewing what looked like ordinary grape bubble gum, blowing modest bubbles that popped quietly against her lips. The executives in their $1,000 suits exchanged knowing glances and barely suppressed. Smirks, just another intern trying too hard to look casual, they thought. But when the armed security breach happened 20 minutes later, and chaos erupted in the 42nd floor of the Meridian Tower, it was her unconventional skill that created the split-second distraction that saved 12 lives. Want to know how a piece of Hubba Bubba became the most important tool in a corporate crisis? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning fog clung to downtown Seattle like a wet blanket, turning the city's glass towers into ghostly silhouettes that faded in and out of the gray mist. Even at 8:30, the streets below were barely visible from the 42nd floor of Meridian Tower, where the autumn air carried the kind of dampness that seeped through expensive wool coats and made even the most confident executives hurry a little faster toward their climate-controlled sanctuaries. Emma Rodriguez had been walking through those same foggy streets since dawn, her worn sneakers navigating puddles that reflected the neon coffee shop signs and early commuter headlights. She carried a canvas messenger bag that had seen better years, its navy blue fabric faded to the color of old denim, and inside that bag was everything she owned that mattered: a laptop held together with electrical tape, 3 spiral notebooks filled with coding diagrams, her grandmother's rosary beads wrapped in tissue paper, and exactly 17 pieces of various bubble gum flavors she'd been collecting since middle school. Most people would have called it a nervous habit, the way she always had a piece of gum working between her molars, creating perfect spheres of pink or blue, or sometimes green, that would expand and contract with the rhythm of her breathing. Her younger sister Maria used to tease her about it, saying she looked like some kind of human bubble machine. But Emma had never seen it as a habit. To her, it was meditation in motion, a way to keep her hands busy and her mind focused when the world around her moved too fast or expected too much. She stepped through the revolving doors of Meridian Tower and felt the familiar rush of recycled air and corporate ambition wash over her. The lobby was all marble and chrome, designed to intimidate visitors and remind them that serious money lived in this building. Security guards in navy blazers stood at attention behind a desk that looked like it could have doubled as a small aircraft carrier, their eyes scanning each person who entered with the practiced indifference of people who'd seen every type of human desperation walk through those doors. Emma approached the security desk and pulled out her temporary visitor's badge, the kind they gave to people who weren't quite employees yet, but weren't exactly visitors either. The guard, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and calloused hands, that suggested he'd worked harder jobs before this one, looked at her ID and then at her face, taking in the nervous energy she was trying so hard to disguise. "First day?" he asked, his voice carrying the warmth of someone who remembered what it felt like to be the outsider looking in. "Sort of," Emma replied, blowing the small bubble that popped softly. "Interview for the cybersecurity internship program. 3rd round." The guard's expression shifted slightly, and she caught what might have been respect flickering across his features. Everyone in the building knew about Meridian Corp's cybersecurity program. It was legendary in the industry, the kind of position that launched careers and attracted the brightest minds from MIT, Stanford, and Carnegie Mellon. Getting to the 3rd round meant she'd already survived cuts that eliminated 90% of applicants. 42nd floor, he said, handing her a visitor's sticker. "Elevators are straight ahead. Good luck." Emma nodded her thanks and walked toward the elevator bank, her sneakers squeaking slightly on the polished marble. Around her, the lobby buzzed with the controlled chaos of a workday beginning. Men and women in perfectly tailored suits moved with the purposeful stride of people who belonged here, Their leather briefcases and designer handbags marking them as members of a club Emma had been trying to join her entire adult life. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor felt like ascending into another world entirely. Through the glass walls, Seattle spread out below like a circuit board made of streets and buildings, the fog lifting just enough to reveal glimpses of Elliott Bay in the distance. Emma pressed her face close to the glass and blew another bubble, watching her reflection distort in the curved surface as the pink sphere expanded and then vanished with a quiet pop. She'd been perfecting her bubble technique since she was 12 years old, sitting in the back row of Mr. Peterson's algebra class and trying to stay invisible while kids like Jennifer Morrison and Brad Westfield got all the attention for being naturally good at everything. While they were answering questions and collecting gold stars, Emma was learning that if you chewed gum at exactly the right temperature and consistency, if you controlled your breathing just right and positioned your tongue with surgical precision, you could create bubbles that were perfectly spherical, mathematically beautiful in their symmetry. It had started as a way to pass time, but somewhere along the way it had become something more, a form of focus, a method of meditation that didn't require sitting still or emptying her mind. When she was working on particularly difficult coding problems, she would chew gum and blow bubbles while her fingers danced across the keyboard, the rhythm of expansion and collapse somehow helping her brain make connections that pure logic couldn't reach. The elevator dinged softly as it reached the 42nd floor, and the doors opened onto a reception area that looked like it had been designed by someone who thought intimidation was the highest form of art. Everything was sharp angles and expensive materials, from the reception desk that looked carved from a single piece of black granite to the abstract sculptures that probably cost more than most people's cars. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, and the morning light streaming through them created geometric patterns on the pale wooden floors. Behind the reception desk sat a woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a corporate fashion magazine, her blonde hair pulled back in a flawless chignon and her makeup applied with the precision of a portrait artist. She looked up as Emma approached, and her expression shifted almost imperceptibly from professional politeness to barely concealed skepticism. "Emma Rodriguez," Emma said, pulling out her ID again. "I'm here for the 9 o'clock interview with the cybersecurity team." The receptionist, whose nameplate read Stephanie, looked Emma up and down with the kind of assessment that could have been used to appraise livestock. She took in the faded jeans, the vintage band t-shirt, the canvas messenger bag, and the piece of grape gum that Emma was currently working into a small, perfect sphere. "Third-round interviews are usually conducted in business attire," Stephanie said, her voice carrying the kind of polite condescension that could cut glass. Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks but kept her voice level. "I was told casual dress was acceptable for technical interviews." Stephanie made a note on her computer with the theatrical precision of someone documenting a significant infraction. "Well, you're a few minutes early. The conference room is just down the hall. The interview panel should be ready for you shortly." Emma nodded and walked in the direction Stephanie had indicated, her sneakers now seeming to squeak even louder on the polished floors. Behind her, she could hear Stephanie speaking in low tones to someone on the phone, and she caught fragments of words that made her stomach tighten with anxiety. "Not quite what we expected," and presentation concerns. The conference room was a monument to corporate power, with a table that could have seated 20 people in chairs that probably cost more than Emma's rent. Floor-to-ceiling windows dominated one wall, offering a view that made the city look like a detailed architectural model spread out below. Emma took a seat facing the windows and pulled out her laptop, trying to focus on her breathing and the familiar rhythm of chewing while she waited. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She'd prepared for this interview the way other people prepared for battle. 3 months of studying Meridian Corp security protocols, memorizing every major cyber attack of the past decade, and practicing her presentation until she could deliver it in her sleep. She knew she was qualified. Her professors at community college had called her work exceptional, and she'd already identified 3 major vulnerabilities in Meridian's public-facing systems just by doing basic reconnaissance from her studio apartment. But sitting in this room, surrounded by the kind of wealth and power she'd only seen in movies, Emma felt the familiar weight of imposter syndrome settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. She didn't belong here. She was a first-generation college student from a family that measured success in terms of making rent on time and keeping the lights on. Her father drove a delivery truck, her mother cleaned office buildings at night, and her little sister was still trying to figure out how to pay for her senior year of high school without taking on debt that would follow her for decades. Emma blew another bubble, watching it expand until it was almost perfectly spherical, before letting it collapse back into her mouth. The familiar motion calmed her nerves and helped her remember why she was here. This wasn't about fitting in or proving she belonged in rooms like this. It was about using her skills to solve problems that mattered, about building a career that could lift her entire family out of the cycle of financial uncertainty that had defined her childhood. The door opened and 3 people walked in, each carrying tablets and wearing expressions that suggested they'd rather be anywhere else. The first was a man in his 50s with silver hair and a suit that probably cost more than Emma's car. His movements were sharp and efficient, and he had the kind of presence that suggested he was used to being the smartest person in every room he entered. This had to be David Chun, the Chief Information Security Officer whose reputation in the industry bordered on legendary. Behind him came a woman about Emma's age, impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit that fit her like it had been designed specifically for her body. Her dark hair was cut in a precise bob that framed features that belonged in a business magazine, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted her right to be in spaces like this. Emma recognized her from the company website. Sarah Mitchell, senior security analyst and the youngest person ever promoted to the executive track at Meridian Corp. The third member of the panel was younger, maybe late 20s, with the kind of deliberately casual style that cost a fortune to achieve. His jeans were perfectly distressed, his button-down shirt was wrinkled in exactly the right places, and his sneakers probably cost more than Emma's entire outfit. But it was his expression that caught her attention. Unlike the others who looked at her with professional interest, he was looking at her with something that might have been amusement, his eyes focusing specifically on the piece of gum she was chewing. "Emma Rodriguez," David Chun said, settling into his chair with the authority of someone accustomed to controlling conversations. "I'm David Chen, CISO. This is Sarah Mitchell, Senior Security Analyst, and Jake Morrison, Lead Developer." Emma stood and offered her hand, which David shook with the perfunctory grip of someone going through motions. Sarah's handshake was firmer, more genuine, but Jake barely made contact before settling back into his chair with a smirk that made Emma's skin crawl. "So," David began, opening his tablet and scrolling through what was presumably Emma's file. "Community college, part-time student, working nights at a call center to pay tuition. Impressive that you made it this far, considering your background." The words were delivered in a tone that suggested he thought it was impressive in the way that a dog walking on its hind legs was impressive. Emma felt her jaw tighten, but she kept her voice steady. "I believe my work speaks for itself," she said. "I've identified several vulnerabilities in your current systems that I'd be happy to discuss." "Oh, this should be good," Jake muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Let me guess, you found our login page and think you're a hacker now?" Sarah shot him a warning look, but Emma saw something flicker across her face that might have been agreement. These people had already decided who she was before she'd even opened her mouth. To them, she wasn't a serious candidate. She was a diversity checkbox being interviewed, so the company could say they'd considered candidates from various backgrounds. Actually, Emma said, pulling up her presentation on her laptop, I found 3 separate injection vulnerabilities. In your customer portal, a privilege escalation bug in your employee access system, and what appears to be a misconfigured database that's leaking customer information to anyone who knows where to look. The room went quiet. David's eyebrows rose slightly, and Sarah leaned forward in her chair. Even Jake's smirk faltered momentarily before returning with added skepticism. That's a serious accusation, David said. Our systems are audited regularly by some of the top security firms in the country. I'm sure they are, Emma replied, clicking to her first slide. But sometimes the best hiding places are in plain sight. May I? David gestured for her to continue, and Emma launched into her presentation. She'd practiced this dozens of times, but sitting in front of these 3 people who clearly saw her as an outsider, she felt her nerves beginning to fray. Her voice sounded smaller than she'd intended, and she caught herself speaking faster than she'd planned, trying to cram all her findings into the shortest possible time before they lost interest entirely. As she spoke, she could see Jake checking his phone under the table, Sarah taking notes but with the detached expression of someone going through motions, and David listening with the kind of attention that suggested he was already formulating polite ways to end the interview early. The familiar weight of not being taken seriously settled over her like a fog, and she found herself falling back on her oldest coping mechanism. She blew a small bubble. It was unconscious, automatic. The gum had been sitting in her mouth throughout the presentation, and the rhythm of chewing had been helping keep her nerves steady. But the moment the pink sphere appeared between her lips, Jake's barely suppressed amusement exploded into open laughter. Are you serious right now? He said, not even trying to keep his voice down. You're sitting in a professional interview, chewing gum like you're at a middle school sleepover. Do you have any idea how unprofessional that looks? Emma felt her face burn with embarrassment, but before she could respond, Sarah was looking at Jake with an expression that could have frozen water. That's enough, she said quietly, but there was steel in her voice that made Jake's laughter die immediately. I'm just saying, Jake continued, but with less confidence now. If she can't even present herself professionally, how can we trust her with enterprise security? Actually, David said, and Emma was surprised to hear something that might have been curiosity in his voice. I'm more interested in these vulnerabilities you've identified. Can you walk us through the technical details? For the next hour, Emma presented her findings with increasing confidence. She showed them exactly how she'd discovered each vulnerability, demonstrated the potential impact of each security flaw, and outlined specific recommendations for remediation. Despite Jake's continued skepticism and occasional eye-rolling, she could see that David and Sarah were genuinely impressed by the depth of her analysis. But throughout the presentation, she was acutely aware of the judgment in the room. Every time she blew a small bubble to manage her nerves, Jake would smirk or shake his head. Even Sarah, who seemed more professional, would glance at Emma's mouth with what looked like disappointment. They were hearing her words, but they were seeing someone who didn't fit their image of what a cybersecurity professional should look like. When the formal presentation ended, David leaned back in his chair with an expression that was difficult to read. Impressive work, he said finally. Your technical analysis is thorough, and your recommendations are solid. But I have to ask, and please don't take this the wrong way, do you think you're ready for the kind of environment we maintain here? This is a high-pressure, client-facing role. Image and presentation matter as much as technical skills. Emma felt something cold settle in her chest. She'd heard variations of this speech before, in other interviews, from other people who looked at her and saw someone who didn't quite fit their mold. The subtext was always the same. You might be smart, but you're not one of us. I understand. "The importance of professionalism," she said carefully. "And I'm willing to adapt to whatever standards the position requires." "Even giving up the gum?" Jake added with a grin that was meant to look friendly but came across as condescending. "I mean, it's kind of your signature move at this point." Emma's hand instinctively moved to her messenger bag, where she kept her collection of different gum flavors. Each piece represented something to her. The grape she was chewing now reminded her of summer afternoons with her grandmother, who'd taught her that sometimes the smallest comforts were the most important. The cinnamon pieces reminded her of her father, who always smelled like Big Red and motor oil when he came home from work. The watermelon flavor was her sister's favorite, and Emma always kept a piece with her as a reminder of why she was working so hard to build a better future. But sitting in this conference room, surrounded by people who saw her chewing gum as evidence of unprofessionalism rather than a harmless personal habit, Emma began to wonder if she was fighting a battle she could never win. Maybe Jake was right. Maybe she really didn't belong in a place like this, where image mattered as much as ability, and where being different was seen as a liability rather than a strength. "I can certainly be more mindful of professional expectations," she said, words tasting bitter in her mouth. The interview continued for another 30 minutes, covering technical scenarios and hypothetical security breaches. Emma answered every question correctly, demonstrated knowledge that impressed even David, and provided solutions that were both innovative and practical. But she could feel the energy in the room, the sense that despite her qualifications, she was still being evaluated on criteria that had nothing to do with her ability to do the job. When it was over, David stood and shook her hand again, this time with slightly more warmth. "We'll be in touch within the week," he said. "Thank you for your time, and congratulations on making it to the final round." That's an achievement in itself. Emma packed up her laptop and walked back through the reception area, where Stephanie watched her with the same barely concealed skepticism she'd shown earlier. The elevator ride down felt longer than the ride up, and Emma spent it staring at her reflection in the polished doors, wondering if she should have worn a suit, should have left the gum at home, should have tried harder to fit into their mold of what a professional should look like. But as the elevator descended and the city spread out below her again, Emma found herself thinking about her grandmother's advice. "Mia, the world will try to make you smaller than you are. Don't let them. Your differences aren't weaknesses to be hidden. They're strengths waiting for the right moment to shine." Emma blew one more bubble, watching it expand in the elevator's mirrored walls until it surrounded her reflection like a pink translucent shield. Then she let it pop and walked out into the Seattle morning, not knowing that in just 3 weeks, she'd be back in that same building, and her unconventional skill would become the thing that saved lives and changed everything. The fog had lifted while she was inside, and now the city sparkled under autumn sunlight that made even the puddles look like scattered diamonds. Emma walked toward the bus stop with her messenger bag slung over her shoulder, another piece of gum already working between her molars. She didn't know yet that David Chun would spend the rest of the day thinking about her technical analysis, or that Sarah Mitchell would quietly advocate for her during the selection committee meeting that afternoon. She also didn't know that Jake Morrison's dismissive attitude would come back to haunt him, or that his inability to see past surface-level differences would soon be exposed as the professional liability it really was. Most importantly, she had no way of knowing that her habit of blowing bubbles, the thing that had made her feel so self-conscious during the interview, was about to become one of the most valuable skills in her arsenal. For now she was just Emma Rodriguez, a community college student who'd given the best interview of her life and was trying not to think about how much she wanted something she probably wouldn't get. She boarded the bus that would take her back to her studio apartment, where she'd spend the rest of the day debugging code and trying not to check her email every 5 minutes. But 3 weeks later, when armed men would storm into that same conference room and threaten the lives of everyone inside, Emma's ability to create perfect bubbles under pressure would become the distraction that allowed 12 people to escape unharmed. The same executives who'd seen her gum chewing as unprofessional would watch in amazement as she used that skill to save their lives, proving once and for all that sometimes the things that make us different are exactly the things the world needs most. The bus pulled away from Meridian Tower, carrying Emma toward a future she couldn't yet imagine, where her grandmother's wisdom would prove prophetic and her unconventional talents would finally find their moment to shine. 3 weeks later, Emma Rodriguez sat in her studio apartment staring at an email that had arrived at 6:47 a.m., the kind of early morning message that either brought dreams to life or shattered them completely. The subject line read, Meridian Corp Cybersecurity Internship, Final Decision, and for 10 minutes she'd been afraid to open it, as if her laptop screen might explode the moment she clicked on David Chun's name. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister Maria. Did you hear anything yet? Mom's been lighting candles all week. Emma smiled despite her nerves. Her mother had indeed been burning novena candles and saying rosaries since the interview, treating Emma's job search like a petition to divine intervention. In their household, big opportunities required both hard work and spiritual backup. Emma unwrapped a piece of strawberry bubble gum, her morning ritual for managing anxiety. As the familiar sweetness spread across her tongue, she clicked on the email and held her breath. Dear Emma, we are pleased to offer you the position of cybersecurity intern in our Advanced Threat Detection Program. Your technical analysis during the interview process was exceptional, and we believe your unique perspective will be valuable to our team. Please report to Human Resources on Monday, November 15th at 8 a.m. to begin your onboarding process. Welcome to Meridian Corp. Emma read the email 3 times before the words actually registered. Then she screamed, a sound of pure joy that probably woke her neighbors, but she didn't care. She was in. After years of community college classes squeezed between call center shifts, after interviews where she felt like a fraud and borrowed professional clothes, after countless rejections that made her question whether she was chasing an impossible dream, she was finally in. She called her parents first, then Maria, then her best friend Carmen, who'd been fielding late anxiety calls for months. By the time she'd shared the news with everyone who mattered, it was nearly noon, and she was working on her 4th piece of gum, blowing celebratory bubbles while she researched everything she could find about her new position. The Advanced Threat Detection Program was Meridian Corp's elite cybersecurity unit, responsible for identifying and neutralizing sophisticated attacks before they could compromise client systems. Emma would be working directly under Sarah Mitchell, the senior analyst who'd seemed genuinely impressed by her technical presentation. It was exactly the kind of opportunity she'd dreamed about, the chance to use her skills on problems that actually mattered. Monday morning arrived with Seattle's typical November drizzle, the kind of persistent rain that made everything look gray and slightly blurred. Emma stood in front of her tiny bathroom mirror, adjusting the collar of the one professional blazer she owned and trying to calm the butterflies that had taken up permanent residence in her stomach. She'd spent the weekend shopping for work-appropriate clothes at discount stores, assembling outfits that looked professional without screaming, recent college graduate trying too hard. The reflection staring back at her looked competent, serious, ready for whatever corporate America could throw at her. But when she opened her mouth to practice introducing herself, she realized she'd unconsciously started chewing gum again. The habit was so ingrained that she barely noticed it anymore, but standing there in her new blazer, Emma suddenly remembered Jake Morrison's dismissive comments about professionalism and presentation. She paused with her hand halfway to her mouth, debating whether to spit out the gum before leaving her apartment. The rational part of her brain said it was a small thing, that she could easily go without chewing gum for 8 hours, but something deeper resisted that logic. This was who she was. The gum chewing wasn't just a nervous habit. It was a connection to her family, her grandmother's memory. The girl who'd learned to find focus and calm in small rituals while the world around her moved too fast. Emma blew a small, perfect bubble and watched it pop in the mirror. Then she grabbed her messenger bag and headed for Meridian Tower, strawberry gum still working between her molars. The 42nd floor looked different when you belonged there. The same reception area that had seemed intimidating 3 weeks ago now felt like territory she had a right to occupy. Stephanie, the receptionist, looked up as Emma approached, and her expression shifted from polite disinterest to something that might have been surprise. "Emma Rodriguez, reporting for my first day," Emma said, presenting her ID with more confidence than she felt. "Oh," Stephanie said, consulting her computer screen with the expression of someone double-checking information she didn't quite believe. "Yes, you're here for the cybersecurity internship. Sarah Mitchell is expecting you. I'll let her know you've arrived." While Stephanie made the call, Emma looked around the reception area with new eyes. She belonged here now. Her technical skills had earned her a place at this table, regardless of what anyone thought about her background or her personal habits. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. Sarah Mitchell appeared within minutes, looking impeccably professional in a navy blue suit that probably cost more than Emma's monthly rent. But her smile was genuine, and when she shook Emma's hand, there was warmth in her grip that hadn't been there during the interview. "Welcome to the team," Sarah said. "Ready for the grand tour?" The next 2 hours were a whirlwind of introductions, security protocols, and technical briefings. Emma met the rest of the cybersecurity team, a mix of experienced professionals and younger analysts who treated her with the cautious friendliness that new team members typically received. Everyone seemed competent and focused, the kind of people who took their work seriously without taking themselves too seriously. Everyone. Except Jake Morrison, who managed to be both present and pointedly absent during Emma's introduction to the development team. He was there physically, sitting at his workstation with multiple monitors displaying complex code. But when Sarah brought Emma around for introductions, his greeting was perfunctory at best. "We've met," he said without looking up from his screens. "Good luck with the internship." Sarah's jaw tightened slightly, but she moved on without comment. Emma filed the interaction away as something to navigate carefully. Office politics were a minefield she'd have to learn to walk through, and making enemies on her first day seemed like poor strategy. By lunchtime, Emma's head was spinning with information about network architectures, threat modeling protocols, and incident response procedures. She'd been assigned a workstation in the main security operations center, a room filled with wall-mounted displays showing real-time network traffic, threat alerts, and global cyber attack patterns. It looked like something out of a movie, all blinking lights and scrolling data streams that made her feel like she was sitting in mission control for the digital world. "Overwhelming, isn't it?" said a voice behind her. Emma turned to find a woman about her age with short black hair and kind eyes, holding 2 cups of coffee. "I'm Lisa Park, senior analyst. Thought you might need caffeine. Is it that obvious?" Emma accepted the coffee gratefully, realizing she'd been so focused on absorbing information that she'd forgotten to eat breakfast. "We've all been there," Lisa said, settling into the chair next to Emma's workstation. "First week is like drinking from a fire hose. Just remember, nobody expects you to understand everything immediately. We're here to help." Lisa turned out to be exactly the kind of mentor Emma hadn't known she needed. Over the next few hours, she walked Emma through the practical aspects of the job that weren't covered in the official briefings. How to read the threat intelligence feeds, which alerts were genuine emergencies and which were routine false positives, the unofficial protocols for escalating issues, and the personalities you needed to understand to be effective. "David Chun is brilliant but impatient," Lisa explained as they reviewed the morning's incident reports. "Give him solutions, not problems. Sarah is the best analyst in the building, but she's under enormous pressure to prove herself as the youngest senior manager in company history. And Jake Morrison is technically excellent, but has strong opinions about how things should be done. I got that impression during my interview, Emma said, popping a small bubble as she spoke. Lisa paused and looked at her with curious eyes. Can I ask you something? The gum chewing. Is that a nervous thing, or just how you concentrate? Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks, the familiar embarrassment that came whenever someone noticed her habit. Little of both, I guess. Helps me think. I know it's probably unprofessional. Actually, Lisa said thoughtfully, I have a friend who's a surgeon, and she says some of the best doctors she knows have little habits like that. Ways of staying calm and focused under pressure. As long as you're doing good work, I don't think anyone cares what helps you get there. The rest of Emma's first week passed in a blur of training sessions, system access requests, and increasingly complex assignments. She threw herself into the work with the intensity of someone who'd waited years for this opportunity, staying late to review threat reports and coming in early to analyze overnight security events. The technical challenges were exactly what she'd hoped for: complex puzzles that required both analytical thinking and creative problem solving. But it was the social dynamics that proved more challenging than she'd anticipated. While most of her colleagues were welcoming and professional, there were subtle signs that not everyone saw her as a permanent member of the team. Comments about the diversity internship program that stopped just short of being actionable. Meetings where her contributions were acknowledged but not built upon. Small exclusions from informal gatherings that might have been oversight but felt deliberate. Jake Morrison's hostility was less subtle. He questioned her recommendations in team meetings, assigned her the most mundane tasks when he had project management authority, and made comments about academic knowledge versus real-world experience that were clearly directed at her educational background. Emma tried to ignore it, focusing on proving herself through her work, but the constant low-level friction was exhausting. 2 weeks into her internship, Emma was working late on a particularly complex malware analysis when she noticed unusual traffic patterns in one of Meridian's client networks. The signatures were subtle, hidden within normal-looking web requests. But something about the timing and frequency triggered her instincts. She spent hours digging deeper, following digital breadcrumbs through layers of obfuscated code and encrypted communications. What she found made her blood run cold. Someone had established a sophisticated backdoor into the client's financial systems, one that would allow them to transfer funds without triggering normal security alerts. The attack was scheduled to execute in less than 48 hours during a weekend, when minimal staff would be monitoring the networks. Emma documented her findings and prepared a detailed report, then faced a dilemma. It was nearly midnight on a Thursday, too late to call a formal team meeting, but too urgent to wait until Monday morning. She decided to email her analysis to Sarah Mitchell and David Chun, along with specific recommendations for immediate action. Friday morning arrived with an emergency all-hands meeting that Emma learned about from Lisa Park's frantic text message. The entire cybersecurity team gathered in the main conference room, where David Chun stood at the head of the table with an expression that mixed frustration and grudging respect. Thanks to excellent work by our newest team member, he began, nodding toward Emma. We've identified and prevented what could have been a catastrophic breach of our client's financial systems. The attack vector was sophisticated enough that it might have gone undetected until after significant damage was done. Emma felt a flush of pride as her colleagues turned to look at her with expressions ranging from impressed to surprised. Even Jake Morrison seemed momentarily stunned, though. He quickly recovered his composure. The client has been notified, David continued, and we're implementing emergency patches across all affected systems. This is exactly the kind of proactive threat detection that our reputation depends on. After the meeting, Sarah Mitchell pulled Emma aside with a smile that reached her eyes for the first time since the interview. Outstanding work, she said. That was graduate-level analysis from someone who's been here 2 weeks. How did you spot something our automated systems missed? Emma thought about how to explain the intuitive process that had led her to investigate the traffic patterns. How she'd been chewing gum and blowing small bubbles while staring at screens full of data, letting her subconscious mind make connections that pure logic might have missed. Sometimes patterns are easier to see when you're not looking directly at them, she said finally. I was kind of letting my mind wander while I reviewed the logs, and something just felt off about the timing. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. Trust your instincts. In this business, sometimes the gut feelings are more valuable than all the algorithms in the world. The success of Emma's threat detection earned her a new level of respect within the team. But it also seemed to intensify Jake Morrison's resentment. During the following week's project assignments, he made increasingly pointed comments about beginner's luck and the danger of promoting people too quickly based on single successes. Real cybersecurity work requires years of experience, he announced during a team meeting where Emma had proposed an innovative approach to threat modeling. Academic exercises and theoretical knowledge only get you so far when you're dealing with actual sophisticated attackers. Emma bit back her response, focusing instead on the strawberry gum she was chewing and the perfect bubble she was forming behind her teeth. She'd learned that engaging with Jake's hostility only escalated the situation, and she was beginning to understand that his behavior said more about his insecurities than her qualifications. But Lisa Park wasn't as diplomatic. Jake, she said, with the kind of quiet authority that made everyone in the room pay attention. Emma's threat detection saved our client potentially millions of dollars and prevented a major security incident. Maybe we should focus on results rather than credentials. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife, and Emma could see David Chen making mental notes about team dynamics that would probably surface in someone's performance. Review. She popped her bubble softly and focused on breathing, trying to stay calm while her professional reputation became a battleground between colleagues. That's when the fire alarm went off. The sound was piercing, urgent, designed to cut through any other noise and demand immediate attention. But this wasn't the monthly test that everyone expected. The announcement that followed made Emma's blood freeze in her veins. This is not a drill. We have reports of an active security threat on floors 40 through 45. All personnel should shelter in place immediately. Do not use elevators. Do not attempt to evacuate. Wait for further instructions from security personnel. Emma looked around the conference room as the reality of the situation sank in. They weren't dealing with a fire or a technical emergency. Someone had breached the building's security, and they were trapped on the 42nd floor with nowhere to run and no way to know what was coming next. Outside the conference room windows, Seattle sparkled in the afternoon sunlight, completely unaware that 12 people were about to face the most terrifying experience of their lives. And Emma Rodriguez, still chewing strawberry bubble gum and trying to process what was happening, had no idea that her unconventional skill was about to become the thing that saved them all. The sound of boots echoing in the hallway made everyone in the conference room freeze. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that spoke of military precision and hostile intent. David Chun moved quickly to the door and turned the lock, though they all knew it wouldn't stop anyone truly determined to get inside. Through the frosted glass panels that flanked the conference room entrance, they could see shadows moving past, dark shapes that paused occasionally as if checking each room systematically. Emma's mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. Corporate espionage, disgruntled former employees, terrorist targeting, random violence. Whatever was happening outside their door, the building's security announcement had been clear about one thing. They were supposed to stay put and wait for help. But as the minutes stretched on and the footsteps grew closer, that strategy felt increasingly inadequate. Sarah Mitchell had pulled out her phone and was typing urgent messages, probably to building security or law enforcement. Lisa Park was checking the windows, though 42 floors up offered no realistic escape route. Jake Morrison sat frozen in his chair, his usual confidence replaced by the kind of paralysis that came with realizing you were completely out of your depth. Emma found herself focusing on the rhythm of her breathing and the familiar motion of chewing gum. The strawberry flavor had long since faded, but the mechanical action of working the gum between her molars helped keep her mind clear, while chaos threatened to overwhelm rational thought. She'd learned years ago that panic was a luxury she couldn't afford, that survival often depended on staying calm when everyone else was falling apart. The footsteps stopped directly outside their door. Emma could see the shadow through the frosted glass, a tall figure that seemed to be examining the conference room placard. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she realized they were about to discover whether the lock would hold, whether whoever was in the hallway was simply checking. Rooms are actively searching for people to harm. The door handle turned slowly, testing the resistance. When it didn't give immediately, there was a pause that felt like hours but probably lasted only seconds. Then came the sound Emma had been dreading, a key card being swiped through the electronic reader. David Chun looked around the room with the expression of someone rapidly running out of options. There was nowhere to hide in a conference room designed for transparency and open communication. The table was too low to provide cover, the windows couldn't be opened, and the only other exit was a supply closet that might hold two people if they squeezed together like sardines. The electronic lock disengaged with a soft click that sounded unnaturally loud in the tense silence. Emma watched the door handle turn and realized that in approximately 10 seconds, their shelter-in-place strategy was about to become a face-to-face confrontation with whoever had taken control of the building. That's when Emma's training kicked in. Not the corporate cybersecurity training she'd received over the past few weeks, but the survival instincts her father had drilled into her during childhood. He'd grown up in neighborhoods where knowing how to disappear, how to create distractions, how to think quickly under pressure meant the difference between walking home safely and becoming another crime statistic. Emma unwrapped a fresh piece of gum, grape this time, and began working it quickly between her teeth. She needed it soft, pliable, ready for maximum expansion. Around her, her colleagues watched in stunned silence as she seemed to ignore the immediate threat in favor of her nervous habit. Even in their current crisis, she could see Jake Morrison shaking his head with disbelief at her apparent lack of focus. The door began to open, revealing a man in dark tactical gear with professional-grade equipment and the kind of cold competence that suggested military training. He wasn't a random criminal or disgruntled employee. This was someone with specialized skills conducting a deliberate operation for reasons they couldn't begin to guess. Emma positioned herself near the corner of the room where she had a clear line of sight to the door while remaining partially concealed behind David Chun's considerable frame. The gum was ready now, worked to exactly the right consistency for what she had in mind. She took a deep breath, positioned her tongue correctly, and prepared to execute a technique she'd been perfecting since middle school, but had never imagined using in a life-or-death situation. The armed man stepped fully into the conference room, his weapon trained on the group of terrified office workers who represented no conceivable threat to someone of his apparent capabilities. His eyes swept the room methodically, cataloging faces and assessing potential resistance. When his gaze reached Emma, she saw something flicker across his features. Puzzlement, perhaps, at finding someone who seemed more focused on chewing gum than cowering in fear. "Everyone against the far wall," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to instant obedience. Hands visible. No sudden movements. The team began moving as directed, but Emma stayed perfectly still, working the gum between her teeth with increased urgency. She needed just a few more seconds to get the consistency exactly right. Too thick and it wouldn't expand properly. Too thin, and it would pop before achieving maximum size. "You," the gunman said, pointing directly at Emma. "Move now." Instead of complying, Emma looked directly into his eyes and blew the largest, most perfect bubble of her entire life. The sphere of grape-colored gum expanded from her lips like a magician's trick, growing larger and larger until it was the size of a softball, then a basketball, completely obscuring her face and capturing every bit of light in the room. The effect was so unexpected, so utterly incongruous with the deadly serious situation, that everyone in the room, including the armed intruder, stopped moving and stared in complete bewilderment. For approximately 3 seconds, the conference room existed in a state of suspended reality where the laws of physics seemed negotiable and the impossible had become visible. A young woman facing down an armed man with nothing but perfectly executed bubble gum technique, creating a moment of pure absurdity that short-circuited every rational response. The gunman's weapon dropped slightly as his brain struggled to process what he was seeing. His training had prepared him for resistance, for panic, for any number of predictable human responses to mortal threat. But nobody had prepared him for performance art executed with chewing gum in the middle of a hostage situation. That moment of confusion was exactly what Emma had been counting on. Sarah Mitchell, who possessed reflexes honed by years of competitive athletics, launched herself across the conference room and tackled the distracted gunman with the efficiency of someone who'd played college rugby. The weapon clattered across the polished floor as both figures went down in a tangle of limbs and tactical gear. David Chun and Lisa Park immediately joined the struggle, using their combined weight to pin the intruder, while Jake Morrison, finally shaking off his paralysis, grabbed the fallen weapon and secured it well away from anyone's reach. Within seconds, what had been a hostage situation became a successful citizen's arrest executed by office workers who'd found courage they didn't know they possessed. Emma's bubble finally popped, covering her face with grape-flavored gum that she wiped away with the back of her hand while watching her colleagues subdue someone who'd probably never been overpowered by cybersecurity analysts in his entire professional career. The rest happened quickly. Building security arrived within minutes, followed by Seattle Police Department tactical teams who secured the intruder and began the process of determining whether he'd been working alone. The building was methodically cleared floor by floor. Though it became apparent that their captive had indeed been a lone operator, conducting what appeared to be industrial espionage, rather than a terrorist attack. During the hours that followed, while police conducted interviews and corporate executives tried to understand how their security had been breached, Emma found herself answering the same question repeatedly. How had she known that creating a distraction would give her colleagues the opening they needed to act? The honest answer was that she hadn't known. She'd simply recognized that their situation required someone to do something unexpected, something that might create a split second of opportunity for people braver than herself to seize the initiative. The bubble blowing hadn't been a calculated, tactical decision so much as the intersection of desperation, instinct, and a lifetime of perfecting an unconventional skill. But as Emma sat in the conference room hours later, giving her statement to detectives who kept shaking their heads in amazement, she realized that her grandmother's words had proven prophetic in ways she'd never imagined. Her differences hadn't been weaknesses to be hidden or overcome. They'd been strengths waiting for exactly the right moment to matter. The story spread through Meridian Corp like wildfire, then beyond into industry circles where tales of corporate heroism were rare. Enough to capture imagination. The woman who'd saved her colleagues with bubble gum became legend, though Emma herself remained uncomfortable with the attention. She'd simply done what the situation required, using the tools she had available when conventional solutions weren't adequate. Jake Morrison's attitude toward her changed overnight, though whether from genuine respect or professional calculation was difficult to determine. He began including her in important projects, seeking her input on complex problems, and treating her contributions with the seriousness she'd earned through both technical competence, and demonstrated courage under pressure. More importantly, Emma discovered that surviving a genuine crisis had given her a new kind of confidence in professional settings. The imposter syndrome that had plagued her throughout her career began to fade, replaced by the knowledge that she belonged in rooms where important decisions were made and challenging problems were solved. 6 months later, when Meridian Corp offered her a full-time position as a senior cybersecurity analyst, Emma accepted without hesitation. Her starting salary was enough to help her parents pay off their mortgage early, to support her sister through college, and to begin building the kind of financial security her family had never experienced. On her first day as a permanent employee, Emma walked into the same conference room where her life had changed forever. She was chewing watermelon gum, her sister's favorite flavor, and thinking about how far she'd traveled from that nervous interview candidate who'd worried about fitting into corporate culture. The truth was that she'd never really fit in, and she'd finally learned that was exactly the point. The world didn't need more people who looked and acted exactly like everyone else. It needed people who could think differently, approach problems from unexpected angles, and blow perfect bubbles when the situation demanded something nobody else could provide. Emma sat down at the conference table, unwrapped another piece of gum, and began preparing for a day of solving problems in her own distinctive way. Outside the windows, Seattle sparkled under morning sunlight, and somewhere in the distance, another young person was probably sitting in another interview, wondering if their unconventional qualities would be seen as assets or liabilities. Emma blew a small, perfect bubble and smiled, knowing that the answer depended entirely on finding the right moment to let those qualities shine. Sometimes the most important skills were the ones nobody else took seriously until the day they saved everyone's life. 2 years had passed since the incident that transformed Emma Rodriguez from an uncertain intern into one of Seattle's most sought-after cybersecurity experts. The story of her unconventional heroism had become industry folklore, told and retold at conferences and corporate training sessions as an example of how thinking outside conventional parameters could save lives and careers. Emma now occupied a corner office on the 45th floor of Meridian Tower, 3 levels above where she'd started her journey. The view from her windows encompassed Elliott Bay, the Olympic Mountains, and the sprawling tech corridor that had become the backbone of Seattle's economy. On clear days, she could see all the way to Mount Rainier, its snow-capped peak serving as a daily reminder that some challenges required long-term persistence to overcome. Her office walls displayed the kind of achievements that would have seemed impossible during those early days of doubt and financial struggle. Cybersecurity certifications from prestigious institutions, awards for innovative threat detection methodologies, and a framed photograph of her accepting recognition from the FBI for her contributions to a multi-agency investigation that had prevented a coordinated attack on West Coast financial institutions. But the item that drew the most attention from visitors was neither a diploma nor an award. Mounted in a simple black frame behind her desk was a single piece of grape bubble gum, perfectly preserved between 2 sheets of glass like a scientific specimen. Most people assumed it was a joke, some kind of ironic commentary on her unusual claim to fame. Only Emma knew it was the actual piece of gum she'd been chewing during those terrifying minutes in the conference room, carefully preserved as a reminder of the moment her life had pivoted towards something she'd never imagined possible. The morning that would change everything again began like any other Tuesday in November. Emma arrived at the office carrying her usual coffee and working through a piece of cinnamon gum, reviewing overnight threat intelligence on her phone while the elevator carried her toward another day of protecting digital infrastructure from increasingly sophisticated attacks. The work had evolved significantly since her early days as an intern, growing more complex as cyber warfare became a permanent feature of global politics and corporate competition. Her team had expanded to include 12 specialists, each bringing unique expertise to problems that required both technical mastery and creative thinking. They developed protocols that other companies now studied and implemented, earned recognition from industry leaders who'd once viewed Meridian Corp as a regional player rather than a national authority, and built a reputation for solving problems that left other security firms baffled. Emma's assistant, a sharp young man named Marcus, who reminded her of herself at that age, was waiting with the morning briefing when she entered her office. He'd learned to ignore her gum chewing entirely, understanding that attempting to change Emma Rodriguez's personal habits was both futile and counterproductive. Some of the company's biggest breakthroughs had emerged from sessions where she'd worked through complex problems while blowing contemplative bubbles, her mind making connections that linear thinking couldn't achieve. "Priority alert from the Department of Homeland Security," Marcus announced, handing her a tablet containing encrypted communications that had arrived during the night. "They're requesting immediate consultation on what they're calling a novel attack vector targeting critical infrastructure. Details are classified, but they specifically asked for you by name." Emma scrolled through the briefing materials, her expression growing more serious with each paragraph. The attack appeared to target power grid control systems across multiple states, using techniques that didn't match any known threat actor profiles. Traditional security measures were proving ineffective, and the potential consequences of a successful breach included cascading failures that could leave millions without electricity during the approaching winter months. "When do they need a response?" Emma asked, already calculating travel logistics and team assignments in her head. "They want you in Washington by tomorrow morning," Marcus replied. "Private jet is being arranged through government channels. Full security clearance has been expedited." Emma nodded, understanding that this wasn't just another consulting assignment. When federal agencies moved this quickly and requested specific personnel by name, it meant they were facing something that had pushed beyond the boundaries of routine cybersecurity response. She'd built her reputation on solving impossible problems, and apparently, someone in Washington believed she might be the only person capable of preventing a catastrophe. The flight to Washington provided 4 hours of uninterrupted time to study classified briefing materials that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. The attacks weren't random or opportunistic. They displayed a level of coordination and sophistication that suggested nation-state involvement, possibly multiple hostile actors working in concert to probe American infrastructure for weaknesses that could be exploited during a future conflict. Emma worked through 3 different flavors of gum during the flight, unconsciously switching between varieties as she processed different types of information. Strawberry for analyzing attack patterns, grape for understanding the technical methodologies, watermelon for thinking through potential countermeasures. Her fellow passengers, all government personnel with security clearances that allowed them to travel on classified missions, had long since stopped paying attention to her oral fixation. In Washington circles, Emma Rodriguez's gum chewing was as well known as her ability to see solutions that eluded everyone else. The briefing took place in a windowless conference room, buried 3 levels beneath the Department of Homeland Security headquarters, surrounded by electronic countermeasures that prevented any form of surveillance or communication interception. The assembled team included representatives from the FBI, NSA, Department of Energy, and several 3-letter agencies whose names Emma wasn't cleared to know. Everyone in the room possessed expertise that had taken decades to develop, but their collective knowledge hadn't been sufficient to counter a threat that seemed to anticipate and adapt to every defensive measure they implemented. Director Susan Walsh, a career intelligence officer whose gray hair and tired eyes spoke of 30 years spent managing crises that never made headlines, led the briefing with the efficiency of someone accustomed to explaining complex problems to people who needed solutions rather than theories. "The attacks began 6 weeks ago," she explained. clicking through slides that displayed network diagrams and traffic analysis charts. Initially, we classified them as probing activities, attempts to map our infrastructure vulnerabilities without causing actual damage. Standard intelligence gathering that we see regularly from hostile actors. The slides changed to show incident timelines and impact assessments. 3 weeks ago, the nature of the attack shifted. Instead of simple reconnaissance, we began seeing active attempts to establish persistent access to control systems, power grid management, water treatment facilities, transportation networks. All coordinated, all using techniques we hadn't encountered before. Emma studied the attack signatures while working the piece of mint gum into perfect consistency. Something about the patterns felt familiar, though she couldn't immediately identify why. The timing intervals, the target selection methodology, the way the attack seemed to learn from each defensive response. It reminded her of something she'd seen before, but in a completely different context. Traditional countermeasures have been ineffective, Director Walsh continued. Every time we implement new security protocols, the attacks adapt within hours. It's like fighting an opponent who can read our playbook in real time. Agent Robert Chun, no relation to David Chun from Meridian Corp., raised his hand from across the table. We've considered the possibility of insider involvement, but our counterintelligence teams haven't found evidence of compromise within any affected organizations. Whatever's happening, it appears to be purely external. Emma blew a small bubble while listening to the discussion, her mind working through possibilities that the assembled experts hadn't yet considered. The adaptive behavior described in the briefing suggested artificial intelligence involvement, but not the kind of AI that most people understood. This was something more sophisticated, more dynamic than traditional automated attack tools. May I see the traffic analysis from the initial probing phase? Emma asked, speaking for the first time since the briefing began. Director Walsh nodded to a technician who pulled up detailed network logs on the main display screen. Emma studied the data streams, looking for patterns that might not be obvious to analysts trained in conventional threat detection methodologies. The numbers scrolled past in seemingly random sequences, but Emma's pattern recognition skills, honed by years of finding needles in digital haystacks, began identifying subtle regularities. There, she said, pointing to a series of seemingly unrelated connection attempts. The timing intervals aren't random. They're following a mathematical progression based on Fibonacci sequences, but modified to account for network latency variations. The room fell silent as the implications of Emma's observations sank in. A Fibonacci-based attack pattern suggested something far more sophisticated than traditional cyber warfare tools. It indicated an AI system capable of mathematical reasoning, adaptive learning, and strategic thinking that approached human-level intelligence. If this is AI-driven, Agent Chen said slowly, we're not just dealing with automated attacks. We're facing an opponent that can think, learn, and evolve its tactics faster than we can develop countermeasures. Emma continued studying the data, while unconsciously working her gum through increasingly complex bubble formations. The mint flavor helped her concentrate on mathematical relationships, and she could feel her subconscious mind making connections that her analytical training couldn't quite reach through logical processes alone. The adaptation speed is too fast for traditional machine learning, she said, blowing a perfect sphere that caught the fluorescent lighting. Normal AI systems require training periods to learn new behaviors. This is responding to our countermeasures in real time, which means it's either vastly more advanced than anything we know exists, or it's getting help from somewhere. Director Walsh leaned forward with the expression of someone who'd been hoping for exactly this kind of insight. What kind of help? Emma popped her bubble softly and reached for another piece of gum, this time choosing grape for its association with her most successful problem-solving sessions. The answer was forming in her mind, but it was so audacious that she needed to Work through the implications before voicing it aloud. What if the AI isn't working alone? She said finally. What if it's part of a hybrid system that combines artificial intelligence with human creativity? The mathematical precision suggests AI, but the strategic adaptability suggests human insight. Someone could be using AI to handle the technical execution while providing real-time strategic guidance. The room erupted in discussion as cybersecurity experts began considering the implications of Emma's theory. A hybrid human-AI attack system would combine the computational power of artificial intelligence with the intuitive problem-solving capabilities that only human minds could provide. It would explain both the technical sophistication and the strategic adaptability that had made the attack so difficult to counter. If you're right, Director Walsh said, then we're not just fighting a computer program. We're fighting a new form of warfare that combines the best aspects of human and artificial intelligence. How do we defend against something like that? Emma continued working through her gum while her mind raced through possibilities. Traditional cybersecurity focused on protecting against known attack vectors and predictable threat behaviors. But defending against a hybrid system would require something entirely different, something that could match both the computational power and the creative thinking of their opponents. We need to fight fire with fire, she said, her voice gaining confidence as the solution crystallized in her mind. If they're using hybrid human AI systems to attack our infrastructure, we need to develop hybrid human AI systems to defend it. But not just copying their approach. We need to find advantages they don't have, capabilities they can't replicate. Agent Chun frowned with the expression of someone trying to understand concepts that stretched beyond his expertise. What kind of advantages? Emma smiled and blew the largest bubble she'd managed all day. A grape-colored sphere that expanded until it nearly obscured her face before popping with a sound that echoed through the conference room. Unpredictability, she said simply. AI systems, even sophisticated ones, operate within logical parameters. They can learn and adapt, but they follow patterns based on computational optimization. Humans, especially humans who think outside conventional boundaries, can do things that don't make logical sense but work anyway. The next 18 hours were a blur of planning sessions, resource allocation meetings, and classified communications with technology companies whose existence wasn't publicly acknowledged. Emma found herself at the center of an operation that would have seemed like science fiction only years earlier, leading a team of the country's most brilliant cybersecurity experts in developing countermeasures against an enemy that represented the cutting edge of digital warfare. The solution they developed was as unconventional as Emma herself. Instead of trying to outcompute their opponents, they created a defense system that deliberately introduced elements of randomness and irrationality into critical infrastructure protection. Security protocols that changed not according to logical algorithms, but according to human intuition, creative impulses, and occasionally, decisions that made no sense whatsoever to artificial intelligence systems trained to optimize outcomes. Emma's gum chewing became an integral part of the process, her bubble-blowing sessions serving as a method for generating truly random inputs that no AI system could predict or replicate. The sight of one of America's top cybersecurity experts solving national security problems while blowing perfectly spherical bubbles became legendary within classified circles, though the details would remain secret for decades to come. The hybrid defense system proved remarkably effective. Within weeks, the sophisticated attacks that had stymied traditional security measures began failing against countermeasures that combined cutting-edge technology with deliberately irrational human behavior. The attackers, whether human, AI, or some combination of both, found themselves unable to predict or adapt to defensive strategies that didn't follow logical patterns. 6 months later, Emma returned to Seattle with a presidential commendation that she couldn't discuss publicly and a deeper understanding of how her unconventional approach to problem solving had evolved from a personal quirk into a genuine strategic advantage. The techniques developed during the crisis were quietly implemented across critical infrastructure systems nationwide, creating a new paradigm for cybersecurity that balanced technological sophistication with human unpredictability. Her office in Meridian Tower remained unchanged, except for a new addition to the wall behind her desk. Next to the preserved piece of grape gum that had started her legend was a small, unassuming device that looked like a simple random number generator. Only Emma knew it was actually a classified piece of technology that used her bubble blowing techniques to generate encryption keys that no computer system could crack, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful weapons were the ones nobody expected. As Emma settled back into her routine of protecting corporate clients from digital threats, she reflected on how far she'd traveled from that nervous young woman who'd worried about chewing gum during job interviews. The world had taught her that being different wasn't something to hide or overcome. It was something to weaponize in service of causes that mattered, something to deploy when conventional solutions weren't adequate to the challenges at hand. Outside her windows, Seattle continued its daily rhythm of innovation and ambition, completely unaware that its security depended partly on a woman who'd learned to save the world one perfectly blown bubble at a time. Emma unwrapped a fresh piece of watermelon gum and began preparing for whatever impossible problem would cross her desk next, confident that somewhere in the intersection of preparation, intuition, and perfectly executed gum bubble technique lay solutions that could change everything. 5 years after Emma Rodriguez had become a legend in cybersecurity circles, she found herself standing in front of 300 of the brightest young minds in technology at the International Conference on Digital Innovation in Geneva. The auditorium buzzed with anticipation as delegates from 47 countries waited to hear from the woman whose unconventional methods had revolutionized how the world thought about cybersecurity and creative problem solving. Emma adjusted the microphone and unwrapped a piece of blue raspberry gum. A flavor she'd recently discovered helped her think through complex explanations. The audience fell silent, some smiling at her trademark habit, others watching with the kind of intense focus reserved for speakers whose insights could reshape entire industries. 10 years ago, I walked into a job interview chewing gum, Emma began, her voice carrying clearly through the state-of-the-art sound system. The people interviewing me saw that gum as evidence that I didn't belong in their professional world. They were wrong about what it meant, but they were absolutely right about one thing. I didn't belong in their world because I was going to create my own. The applause was immediate and sustained, but Emma noticed something more important than the enthusiasm of her audience. In the front rows sat dozens of young people, many of them women, many clearly from backgrounds that hadn't traditionally produced technology leaders. They were listening with the intensity of people who saw their own struggles reflected in her story, who understood that her success represented possibilities they hadn't dared to imagine for themselves. The question I get asked most often, Emma continued, working the gum into the perfect consistency while she spoke, is whether I always knew that my unusual habits would become professional advantages. The honest answer is no. For most of my life, I thought being different was something to apologize for, something to hide or overcome. She paused to blow a modest bubble, the kind of small, perfect sphere that had become her signature gesture. During public speaking, the audience chuckled appreciatively, but Emma could see that many of them were taking notes, as if her bubble-blowing technique contained secrets they needed to decode and implement. But here's what I've learned through experience, through success, and through more failures than I care to count. The world doesn't need more people who think exactly like everyone else. Innovation happens at the intersection of different perspectives, unusual approaches, and the willingness to look foolish while attempting something that's never been tried before. The presentation that followed was unlike anything the conference had featured in its 20-year history. Instead of traditional slides filled with technical diagrams and statistical analyses, Emma demonstrated her problem-solving methodology. In real time, she presented the audience with a hypothetical cybersecurity scenario, then worked through potential solutions while chewing gum and blowing bubbles of varying sizes, each one representing a different approach to the problem. Traditional logic tells us that network intrusions follow predictable patterns, she explained, creating a bubble approximately the size of a tennis ball. Attackers probe for weaknesses, exploit vulnerabilities, and execute their objectives. According to established protocols, defensive strategies typically focus on identifying these patterns and implementing countermeasures. The bubble popped, and Emma immediately began working the gum into preparation for her next demonstration. But what happens when attackers deliberately abandon logical patterns? What if they're using artificial intelligence systems that can adapt faster than human defenders can respond? Traditional approaches become inadequate. She blew a larger bubble, this one expanding to nearly basketball size before she carefully maneuvered it away from her face. This is where unconventional thinking becomes essential. When logical approaches fail, sometimes the solution requires doing something that doesn't make sense to anyone else, including yourself. The audience watched in fascination as Emma used her bubble-blowing demonstration to illustrate concepts that would have required hours of traditional explanation. The physical act of creating perfectly spherical forms from chewing gum became a metaphor for transforming simple materials into complex solutions, for finding beauty and functionality. In unexpected places, Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a renowned AI researcher from Tokyo, raised her hand during the question period. Ms. Rodriguez, your methods have proven effective in cybersecurity applications, but do you believe this approach to problem solving could be applied to other fields? Climate science, medical research, space exploration? Emma smiled and began working a fresh piece of gum, this time choosing cherry for its association with her most creative thinking sessions. That's exactly the right question, Dr. Tanaka. The specific technique doesn't matter. Bubble gum worked for me because it connected to childhood memories, family traditions, and personal comfort zones that helped my mind work more effectively. Other people might find their breakthrough moments while knitting, playing musical instruments, or solving crossword puzzles. She paused to blow a cherry-red bubble that caught the stage lighting beautifully. The key is identifying what helps your brain make connections that linear thinking can't achieve, then having the courage to use those techniques regardless of what other people think about their appropriateness. A young man from Mumbai stood up in the middle section. But how do you convince organizations to accept unconventional approaches? Most companies want employees who fit established molds, who present themselves according to traditional professional standards. Emma's expression grew more serious as she considered the question that struck at the heart of systemic barriers that prevented innovation and excluded talented people who didn't conform to narrow definitions of professionalism. Change doesn't happen all at once, she said finally. It starts with individuals who demonstrate that different approaches can produce superior results. Then it spreads to teams that are willing to prioritize outcomes over appearances. Eventually, entire organizations begin to understand that diversity of thought requires diversity of behavior, diversity of background, and diversity of methods. She unwrapped another piece of gum, this time opting for watermelon as she prepared to share insights that had taken years of experience to develop. But here's the most important thing I've learned. You can't wait for permission to be yourself. You can't wait for someone else to validate your approach or confirm that your unusual methods are acceptable. You have to believe in your own values strongly enough to persist when others doubt you. The bubble she blew this time was smaller, but held its form longer than usual, rotating slowly in the stage lights while maintaining perfect spherical geometry. Every major breakthrough in human history happened because someone was willing to look foolish, to try something that had never been attempted, to persist despite criticism from people who couldn't see beyond conventional boundaries. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Emma noticed something more significant than audience approval. Throughout the auditorium, young people were sitting straighter, taking notes more furiously, some of them chewing gum or engaging in their own small fidgeting behaviors with newfound pride rather than embarrassment. After the presentation, Emma was approached by Dr. Sarah Chun, director of the Global Innovation Initiative, a multinational program designed to identify and nurture unconventional approaches to major world problems. "We've been following your work for years," Dr. Chun explained as they walked through the conference center's modern corridors. "Your success in cybersecurity has inspired similar approaches in other fields. Medical researchers using dance to understand protein folding, climate scientists using poetry to communicate complex data, engineers using cooking techniques to design more efficient materials." Emma blew a contemplative bubble while processing the implications of what Dr. Chen was describing. Her individual success had apparently sparked a broader movement toward accepting and encouraging unconventional methodologies across multiple disciplines. "We're launching a new program next year," Dr. Chun continued, "specifically designed to identify and support young innovators whose approaches don't fit traditional academic or corporate models. We'd like you to serve as the program's founding director." The offer was both flattering and terrifying. Emma had built her reputation by solving specific problems in specific contexts, but directing a global program would require leadership skills and organizational capabilities that she'd never had to develop. It would mean leaving the technical work she loved and moving into administrative roles that might not play to her strengths. "Can I think about it?" Emma asked, already knowing that her decision-making process would involve several different flavors of gum and numerous contemplative bubble-blowing sessions. "Of course," Dr. Chun replied with a smile that suggested she understood Emma's need for unconventional decision-making methods. "Take all the time you need. Revolutionary changes shouldn't be rushed." That evening, Emma walked through Geneva's historic district while working through a piece of grape gum and thinking about roads not taken, responsibilities accepted, and the weight of becoming a symbol for people whose talents didn't fit conventional molds. The narrow cobblestone streets and medieval architecture provided a stark contrast to the high-tech conference environment, reminding her that innovation had been happening for centuries, often driven by people who were willing to challenge established ways of doing things. She found herself at a small cafe overlooking Lake Geneva, where she ordered coffee and continued her contemplative bubble blowing while watching sailboats navigate the darkening water. The decision she was facing wasn't just about career advancement or professional recognition. It was about whether she was ready to take responsibility for changing systems that had excluded people like her for generations. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Maria, now a successful software engineer who credited Emma's example with giving her the confidence to pursue technology, despite facing similar doubts about belonging in male-dominated spaces. "Saw your presentation online. Mom cried. Dad said he always knew his daughters would change the world. When are you coming home?" Emma smiled and blew a perfect bubble that reflected the cafe's warm lighting. Home meant Seattle, meant family dinners where her success was celebrated, but never allowed to overshadow the importance of staying connected to the people and values that had shaped her. It meant visiting her old neighborhood and seeing young people who looked like her, who faced similar challenges but might now believe that unconventional paths could lead to extraordinary destinations. 3 days later, Emma called Dr. Chun and accepted the position as founding director of the Global Innovation Initiative's Unconventional Methods program. The decision felt both inevitable and terrifying, like all the best choices she'd made throughout her career. The program launch took place 8 months later in São Paulo, bringing together 200 young innovators whose approaches to major problems defied traditional categorization. There was Marcus from Lagos, who used traditional African drumming patterns to optimize traffic flow algorithms. Priya from New Delhi, who applied classical dance movements to robotics design. Ahmed from Cairo, who used calligraphy techniques to develop more efficient solar panel configurations. Emma stood before this diverse group of unconventional thinkers and felt something she'd never experienced before: the deep satisfaction of knowing that her individual success had created opportunities for people whose talents might otherwise have been overlooked or dismissed. These young innovators wouldn't have to choose between being themselves and being successful. They could be both. 5 years ago, she told the assembled participants, I was told that chewing gum during professional presentations was inappropriate, unprofessional, and potentially career-limiting. The people who told me that weren't wrong about social expectations. They were wrong about what mattered more. She unwrapped a piece of blue raspberry gum, the same flavor she'd been chewing during her Geneva presentation, and began the ritual that had become inseparable from her problem-solving methodology. What matters more than meeting other people's expectations is solving problems that matter, creating value that didn't exist before, and opening doors for people who come after you. Everything else is just noise. The bubble she blew was larger than usual, a blue sphere that expanded until it nearly filled the space between her face and the microphone. When it popped, the sound echoed through the auditorium like a starting pistol, signaling the beginning of something unprecedented in the history of organized innovation. Over the following months, the program participants made breakthroughs that validated Emma's belief in the power of unconventional approaches. Marcus's traffic optimization algorithms reduced urban congestion by 30% in pilot cities. Priya's dance-inspired robotics helped develop prosthetic limbs that moved with unprecedented naturalness. Ahmed's calligraphy-based solar panels achieved efficiency levels that traditional engineering approaches had been unable to reach. Each success generated media attention that highlighted not just the innovations themselves, but the unconventional methods that had made them possible. The global conversation about talent, creativity, and professional norms began shifting in directions that would have seemed impossible when Emma was a nervous intern trying to hide her gum-chewing habit. But the program's most important impact wasn't measured in technical breakthroughs or media coverage. It was visible in the confidence of young people who now understood that their differences weren't obstacles to overcome, but advantages to cultivate. They were learning to see their unusual approaches not as evidence of inadequacy, but as tools for solving problems that conventional thinking couldn't address. Emma's office in the program's Geneva headquarters became a pilgrimage site for young innovators from around the world. The walls displayed not just her academic credentials and professional awards, but also dozens of thank you letters from people whose lives had been changed by her example. Teachers who now encouraged students to find their own problem-solving methods. Parents who supported children whose talents didn't fit traditional molds. Employers who had learned to value results over conformity. The preserved piece of grape gum from her original crisis still held a place of honor behind her desk, but it was now accompanied by artifacts from program participants, whose own unconventional tools had become legendary within their fields. A paintbrush used to design quantum computing algorithms. A jump rope that had inspired breakthrough insights in renewable energy. A recipe for bread that had led to discoveries in material science. Each artifact told a story about the power of accepting yourself completely, about refusing to hide the qualities that made you different, about understanding that innovation required not just intelligence, but the courage to look foolish while attempting something that had never been tried before. As Emma sat in her office on a quiet Friday evening, working through a piece of strawberry gum while reviewing applications from the next group of unconventional innovators, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from a nervous interview candidate to the director of a program that was changing how the world thought about talent and creativity. The young woman who had worried about fitting into corporate Culture had become someone who helped others understand that fitting in wasn't the goal. The goal was finding the courage to stand out, to be different, to use whatever tools worked best for your mind, regardless of whether other people understood or approved. Emma blew one final bubble of the day, watching it expand in the office's warm lighting before letting it pop with a soft sound that had become the soundtrack to revolutionary change. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new innovators, new opportunities. To prove that the most powerful solutions often came from the most unexpected places. Outside her windows, Geneva sparkled under evening stars that had witnessed centuries of human innovation, most of it driven by people who were willing to think differently, act unconventionally, and persist despite doubt from those who couldn't. See beyond established boundaries. Emma smiled and began planning for a future where being different wasn't just accepted, but celebrated as humanity's greatest competitive advantage. 20 years had transformed Emma Rodriguez from an uncertain young woman into a force that reshaped how the world understood innovation and human potential. The Global Innovation Initiative she directed had grown into the most influential talent development program on Earth, with graduates working in every major technology company, research institution, and government agency across 6 continents. Emma stood in her childhood bedroom in Seattle, packing the last of her grandmother's belongings. The small house her family had struggled to keep during her college years was now being converted into a scholarship foundation headquarters, funded by Emma's speaking fees and consulting work. Her grandmother's sewing table would become a workspace where young innovators could apply for grants that would allow them to pursue unconventional approaches to their education and careers. Maria walked in carrying a box of old photographs, her own success story having inspired thousands of young women to enter technology fields. She'd founded 3 startups, each focused on making complex technology accessible to underserved communities. And her work had been featured on magazine covers around the world. "Remember this?" Maria asked, holding up a faded school photo of 10-year-old Emma, blowing an enormous pink bubble that obscured most of her face. "Mom used to say you were practicing for your future career." Emma laughed, unwrapping a piece of the same grape flavor she'd been chewing that life-changing day in the Meridian Tower conference room. She probably had no idea how right she was. The photo captured something essential about the girl who would grow up to change the world. Even at 10, Emma had been completely absorbed in perfecting her technique, oblivious to the other children who thought her hobby was silly or inappropriate. She'd been practicing the kind of focused persistence that would later help her solve problems others couldn't even see. "The foundation is going to help so many kids," Maria said, carefully placing the photo in a frame that would hang in the scholarship office. "Kids who think they're weird or different or not smart enough because they don't fit the usual patterns." Emma nodded, thinking about the hundreds of letters she received each month from young people around the world who'd found the courage to pursue their dreams after learning about her journey. Students who'd stopped hiding their stimming behaviors. Artists who'd started applying creative techniques to scientific problems. Inventors who'd learned to trust their intuition, even when data suggested different approaches. The doorbell rang, and Emma went downstairs to find a delivery truck parked outside. The driver, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, handed her a large package addressed to Emma Rodriguez, bubblegum pioneer. "Special delivery from Switzerland," the driver said with a smile. "The sender said to tell you congratulations on your retirement." Emma opened the package to find a custom-made display case containing 20 different flavors of artisanal bubblegum, each one crafted by a small company in Geneva that specialized in creating products for people with sensory processing needs. The accompanying note was from Dr. Sarah Chun, for the woman who proved that the best innovations come from the most unexpected places. "Thank you for showing us that different is powerful." That evening, Emma sat on her family's back porch watching Seattle's skyline glow in the distance. The city had grown dramatically during her career, becoming a global center for technology. and innovation. But more importantly, it had become a place where young people could see reflections of themselves in success stories, where diversity of thought was valued as much as technical skill. Her phone buzzed with a video call from Ahmed in Cairo, one of her first program participants, who now ran the Middle East division of the Innovation Initiative. Behind him, Emma could see dozens of young inventors working on projects that combined traditional crafts with cutting-edge technology. "Emma," Ahmad said, his face beaming with excitement, "I wanted to share something with you. Remember Fatima, the girl who used henna patterns to design circuit boards? She just got accepted to MIT with a full scholarship. She's going to study biomedical engineering." Emma felt tears welling up in her eyes, the same overwhelming emotion she experienced every time one of her kids achieved something remarkable. Fatima had been told by teachers that her interest in decorative arts was incompatible with serious academic study. Now she was headed to one of the world's most prestigious engineering programs, carrying forward the lesson that traditional techniques could inspire revolutionary innovations. "Tell her I'm proud of her," Emma said, unwrapping a piece of watermelon gum. "And remind her that the patterns that make her different are exactly what the world needs." After the call ended, Emma walked through the house one final time, her footsteps echoing in rooms that had shaped her understanding of family, persistence, and the importance of staying connected to your roots regardless of how far your success carried you. Tomorrow, the Scholarship Foundation would officially open, and the first group of recipients would begin their journeys toward careers that might not even exist yet. The Foundation's mission statement, which Emma had written while chewing her way through an entire pack of mixed flavors, was simple: to support young innovators whose approaches to problem-solving don't fit traditional molds, but whose perspectives are essential for addressing humanity's greatest challenges. Emma's own retirement plans were characteristically unconventional. Instead of writing memoirs or accepting board positions, she was planning to spend the next phase of her life traveling to remote communities around the world, identifying young people whose talents had been overlooked by traditional educational systems and connecting them with resources that could help them develop their unique gifts. She'd already committed to spending 6 months in rural Montana working with Native American students who were using traditional ecological knowledge to develop new approaches to environmental restoration. After that, she'd travel to villages in Peru where young people were combining ancient Incan engineering techniques with modern material science to create earthquake-resistant buildings. Each destination had been chosen because it represented communities where unconventional wisdom had been preserved despite pressure to conform to mainstream educational and professional standards. Emma wanted to learn from these traditions while helping young people understand that their heritage could be a source of innovation rather than an obstacle to overcome. As midnight approached, Emma sat at her grandmother's old kitchen table and pulled out a piece of paper to write a letter to her younger self, the nervous college student who'd worried about fitting into corporate culture. "Dear Emma," she wrote, pausing to blow a perfect bubble that reflected the kitchen's warm lighting, "the things that make you different aren't problems to solve. They're superpowers waiting for the right moment to emerge. The gum chewing that embarrasses you in interviews will someday save lives. The pattern recognition skills that help you blow perfect bubbles will revolutionize cybersecurity. The persistence you learned from practicing silly tricks will help you change the world." She paused, working the gum into fresh consistency, while searching for words that could capture everything she'd learned about courage, authenticity, and the power of refusing to hide who you really are. "Don't try to be like everyone else," she continued. "The world already has enough people who think and act exactly the same way. What it needs is people who can see solutions that others miss, who can find beauty and functionality in unexpected places, who can persist when logic says to give up." Emma sealed the letter in an envelope addressed to the Scholarship Foundation. with instructions that it should be shared with every young person who expressed doubt about whether their unconventional approaches were valuable. She wanted future generations to understand that the qualities that made them feel like outsiders might actually be exactly what the world needed most. Outside, Seattle's lights twinkled like stars scattered across the landscape, each one representing dreams, ambitions, and possibilities that previous generations couldn't have imagined. Somewhere in those lights were young people working late into the night, pursuing ideas that others had dismissed, developing skills that didn't fit traditional categories, preparing to solve problems that hadn't even been identified yet. Emma blew one final bubble of the evening, watching it expand in the kitchen's soft glow before letting it pop with the quiet sound that had accompanied every major breakthrough of her career. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of a new chapter, but the core lesson would remain the same: the courage to be authentically yourself, completely and unapologetically, was the foundation of every innovation that had ever mattered. Years later, when historians wrote about the transformation of global innovation culture in the early 21st century, they would point to Emma Rodriguez as the catalyst who proved that diversity of thought required diversity of behavior, that breakthrough solutions came from people who were willing to look foolish while attempting something unprecedented, and that the most powerful weapon against impossible problems was often the simplest: the courage to be exactly who you were, bubble gum and all. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.